Hello and welcome to a new discussion program called Church and State with Paul Green. I am a member of the Christian Democratic Party, also known as CDP. We currently hold the balance of power in the upper house in the New South Wales Parliament. The Christian Democratic Party has the privilege of voicing many concerns to the state government, as well as playing other important roles in Parliament such as making, reviewing and amending legislation to keep our community safe, free and prosperous. In this episode, we will explore the movement of Christianity in our nation and the blockers to the Church's message of hope. In 1911, 0.4% of the people identified with no religion, but by 2016 that figure had grown to 30.1%. That is nearly a third of the population. In this episode, we discuss the generational change of faith, values and belief in Australia. We look at what it means to be Christian today and what people seek from churches, government leaders and politicians. To help us discuss today's topics, we welcome social researcher, trend analyst and demographer Mark McCrindle. Also joining the discussion is well-known Australian Christian communicator, media presenter, leader and social commentator Carl Faze. Well, welcome Carl and Mark to the show. And firstly, let me start with a question to you both. 100 years ago, less than 1% of Australians identified with no religion. And today, over 30% of people say they have no religion. What does this mean for the Australian community? And Mark, can I start with you?
Well, historically, Australia has had a stronger Christian connection than it does these days. And there was a certain social desirability, perhaps social pressure around identifying with Christianity. That's clearly evaporated. And now it's probably the opposite. You've got to swim against the tide to say I'm a Christian and I'm a churchgoer. So we've seen that turn around. And therefore, there's no shame. In fact, probably people feel a lot of kudos in saying, I don't believe anything. And that's why we've seen those numbers go from 1% no religion to 30%. And there's a pretty clear trend line that'll probably keep growing there.
Carl, do you want to?
Yeah, it's interesting. Apparently the first survey I'd seen in Australia for probably back in the 19th century was that there was 100% Christians in the country. So, half of them came out as convicts. So they were all Christians, had a discipleship issue, but they were all Christians. I agree with Mark completely. Do we really think that in 1950 that 96% of people were actually Christians? Well, I don't think they were, but it was the right thing to say. Whereas now it's sort of what we've lost is not, I don't think we've lost sense of people now they're not Christians. What we've lost is nominalism. That people used to be nominally Christian and they were happy to say they were. Well, now they're not particularly happy to say they are, and they're more willing probably to be more honest.
And just on that, Paul, I think the data really shows that very point, that even in the last 5 years we've gone, total people identifying with Christianity has gone from 61% of Australians to 52% in the census most recently, so that's quite a drop. But over that same period of time, the proportion of people attending church has stayed at 15%. And if anything, the most recent data shows it's probably 16%. So those that are active with their faith, their Christian faith, is unchanged, even though this sense of cultural Christianity or broad identification with Christianity is evaporating.
Would you have a view that lifting the no religion from the bottom of the census report to the top of the list would have an impact?
Definitely. Those methodological changes with surveys, the structure of where you put answers, has an impact. And in politics, if you can be the first name on the ballot,
it's always helpful.
It's nice. It's nice. And what happened in this most recent census, which was different to previous census, is that no religion, which was at the bottom, exactly as you said, became the first option. And so that definitely would have had a lift in the numbers as well.
Yeah, and add to that, Paul, you had the Australian Rationalist Society, whatever they call themselves, running a campaign.
Yeah.
Yes. There's no other question there's a campaign on what to vote, but on that question there's a campaign, and you have people within the department shifting where boxes are. So you've got to, there's more than just a survey going on here. There's actually a bit of social engineering.
Mark, in 2017, you published a survey called the Faith and Belief in Australia report. Was this in response to that census data?
Yeah, it was. It was to use the census question, but as Carl said, a few deficiencies we might argue with the question, or at least the way the census question looks is a bit different to how Australians think about their faith. For example, there's one box for Hinduism and one box for Islam, but there's no box called Christianity on the census. It's by denomination, it's Uniting and Anglican, and a lot of people don't think that way. They don't think about themselves by denomination, they think about themselves by religion. So, it's not quite a level playing field in that sense. Plus, it's an optional question. 1 in 10 Australians left the question blank. It'd be good to know where they actually sit. And there's no box for spiritual but not religious. So we took that, we adjusted the question with those options, made it compulsory, and we found that 10% who didn't fill it in, many of them fall into the no religion box, as you'd probably expect. We found that there's a fair few people in the total Christianity box or denominational box that when given an option of spiritual not religious, they tend to opt there. So Australians are less institutional as they think about their faith, a bit more individualistic. That's where the spiritual not religious group came. And so we found that total Christianity was a little bit lower than even the census found, no religion a bit higher, and then this emerging box of spiritual not religious.
So what was the need for your report, do you think?
Just to get a bit of a census to the lay of the land, to unpack a little bit more what was behind that no religion. Is it that people are saying no religion because they don't believe in anything beyond the physical? They don't have any metaphysical beliefs or concept there? Or is it that they're just against institutional Christianity? We wanted to dig deeper on that. We wanted to find out a little bit more about when people say Christianity is my religion, what does that mean to them and how do they practice that? How does it make a difference in their life? So we unpacked some deeper issues behind those mainstream identification questions, and that was a key part of it.
I mean, interesting, Paul, because I'm a bit across some of those details of what Mark has done, and intriguing in a lot of people in the Australian setting, there's a sense of like everybody dislikes Christians, they all think we're hypocrites, it's all bad news. Yeah. And what's helpful about the Faith and Belief report is it's actually not all bad news. In fact, it's probably more positive than most people think, even though there's a drop in people that would name themselves as being Christians.
Mark, what did people say were the biggest blockers to Christianity or going to church?
Well, that's probably one of the reasons that there's a bit of pushback on identifying with Christianity is this sense of Christianity in the church, particularly as an institution. And Australians are over institutions, whatever they may be, even political parties at times, or it can be around union membership, around joining the local Rotary Club. I don't need to be part of that to serve my community. And so it is with the church. And so that was, I guess, part of the pushback there. And what is it about the institution they don't like? The number one issue was church abuse. Yeah. And we've just been through a couple of years of a Royal Commission, which has unveiled a lot of the tragedy that has been committed in the name of the church. So I think that's front of mind for Australians and real. A second big issue is hypocrisy, which probably flows on from that. And of all institutions in our society, probably the church upholds standards and communicates those standards, and yet when those standards aren't lived, Australians are very quick to see inauthenticity and to call that, and hypocrisy was a big one. Religious wars was third on the list, and that highlights that there's historical issues that still are in the minds of Australians, and if the church is a place of peace and relationship with God, what was the story with those crusades and the like? Issues around money was a real pushback as well. Australians are like, don't churches trying to get a lot of money out of people and a lot of offerings and that sort of thing. So a bit unsure about that. And just the exclusive nature of the church, that they can be a little bit isolated in the corner, and what do they even do, and are they part of mainstream society, which is not, of course, what churches want to be perceived as, and churches are working hard to connect with their community, but there's still a perception that Christianity has its own ecosystem going on over there, and I'm not part of that. That was a bit of the issue as well.
Paul, it's really interesting to look at the difference in the report between the concrete and the abstract. So when in the abstract, where what do you think of the church? All those blockers come up, and we really dislike the church. One of the questions was, do you know a Christian? And 92% of Australians said they know a Christian. When they were asked, what do you think of those Christians? The top 5 answers were all positive. like caring, kind, all these sorts of... So when you think of the church, what do you think of the church? Oh, they're all hypocrites. Do you know a Christian? Yeah, Fred and Mary. What are they like? They're great people. So the interesting thing is to keep in mind that often people talk about faith and church from an institutional perspective, in the abstract, but when they talk about people they actually know, it's actually quite different.
Mark, what did Australians list as the negative influences that tainted their perception of Christians or Christianity?
Well, there were those issues around church and behaviour and legacy issues, and all of those were one category. And then Australians have their own doctrinal hang-ups with what the church might be teaching. Yes. And so it's not at all to say that the church should change those truths, because the church preaches and is based on the Bible and is based on truth. But Australians still have some hang-ups with some of those key issues. I mean, science versus evolution was one of those key ones. Miracles. Australians have, in modern, sophisticated, science-based society, we start talking about miracles from the Bible, and Australians are a bit unsure about that. Even the existence of God and who God is communicated to be and revealed to be in the Bible, the resurrection of Christ, the role of women as people perceive that in the scriptures, homosexuality, hell and condemnation. These were all issues, and we can all understand issues that the broader community has when it comes to hearing church teaching and a biblical perspective. And so perhaps the church hasn't communicated those issues very well, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around that as well, but certainly there were strong reservations around those issues from the broader Australian public.
So Carl, this is where you become a defence attorney. Can you mount a defence for Christianity on these matters?
The intriguing thing is that talking about Christianity, belief in Jesus, what the Bible has to say, and understanding God, is not a popularity contest. This is not trying to pick a bunch of things that you know people will like, and therefore I'll sell this to you. You know, as somebody has said years ago, you know, if you pick the bits of the Bible that you like and the bits of Christian teaching that you like, and you dismiss the bits you don't like, it's not God you believe in, it's yourself. Yes. Now, if people kind of let that sink in a bit, that's where we end up. We actually don't want to worship God. You know, as somebody else has said, in the beginning, God created humanity, and we've been returning the favour ever since. You know, we want to create God in our image. And yet that's what we're trying to do, is understand, is God communicated to us? Is that God who's communicated to us given a set of parameters that is best for life? Well, what's the best way to understand it? Well, I would say to clearly read the Bible and to put society through the grid of the Bible, not the Bible through the grid of society. And if we can do that, we're not going to be popular, but then that's okay.
Well, it's funny, as a political party, we face this all the time, is that we'll have people, I like to say Christians and people of goodwill, because they both vote for us, I'm sure. But we'll quite often get Christians that will not like something we've done, and they'll leave voting for our party to go and vote for another party, little knowing that they're probably voting for another party with 20 worse other points than ours. So, Mark, almost 2 in 3 builders, you say, 63% identify with Christianity, but only 1 in 3 Generation Y, 32% do so. Mark, why do you think that belief is more prevalent in the older generation?
Yeah. Well, that older generation that you talk about, the builders, as they've been discussed, you know, they built so much of our society, the ethics and values, and indeed the Christian church in this country, and certainly a lot of Christian institutions. And so belief has been core for them from a young age, and yet the younger generation have been shaped in these more secular times, and so we have lower connection. But I think part of the reason is that the church has not been as focused and perhaps as relevant in engaging with this next generation, and maybe there's more to do there to turn that statistic around.
Carl, do you want to add to that?
The older generation, the builders, loyalty was a big deal for them. You know, they grew up through the Second World War or the end of it, and into a difficult time of depression. And so being loyal to your friends, loyal to your community, that was like the foundational value. So being loyal to your belief in your church was part of that. Then you rolled into, you know, the baby boomers, the 60s and the 70s, and experimentation and new options, and that just is just has continued with each ensuing generation. So therefore, choice, what matters to me, becomes more important. Loyalty is an old idea. So I think that's changed the way that they think, act and respond.
Well, we certainly face that in youth ministry. We called it the better offer generation. And, as a youth pastor, you'd be trying fairly hard to get consistency in these young lives to come to youth groups. So you give them the message, have some fun. The three core messages of youth ministry: love, atmosphere, and acceptance. Acceptance. So if you've got a good youth ministry, you're giving love to the kids. You've got atmosphere, so all hell's breaking loose virtually around the youth program, but you're accepting them for where they're at and who they are, and that sort of promotes a good youth program. But every week, if they got that last minute phone call for a party, they were gone. There was just no loyalty. Yep. And of course, we've since seen that same culture has transferred into the business world, that it's very hard to get young people to be settled into an apprenticeship or to some sort of training or upskilling because they up and go if they don't like it.
Yeah, and even the latest generation, Paul, there's almost another change which some of the writers seem to be writing about at the moment, is the importance of safety. And probably there's a whole group of parents who are very concerned about the safety of their children, but physical safety is actually morphed into emotional safety, and therefore you can't have ideas that you don't like, you can't have ideas that are challenged. This sort of mollycoddle the group of people that don't want to hear an idea they don't like. Well, that sort of seeps into faith and belief as well, because I want my faith to fit every one of my ideas, every one of my lifestyle choices, everything that I want to see happen. And that becomes pretty hard to have a message that might clash with what they would like to think is the truth.
Well, I think the redeeming work of Christ is that very fact, is that we're not perfect, we are going to blow it, and you can turn a new page, have a new canvas every day. And I think that's the hope of God,
And I think that's the ultimate reality. As Carl says, we've got a generation looking for inclusion. That's the big value, right, in all areas. And that's why the spiritual, not religious, because I want to be inclusive of a bit of this faith and a bit of that faith and not upset anyone. But Christ is the ultimate in inclusion, isn't he? He accepts everyone. He goes after the sinner and the lost, and every tribe and nation, all one and united to God through Christ. And so that's real inclusion. That's solid inclusion, and a very relevant message for our society that perhaps would look for inclusion in a multitude of different worldviews and faiths.
Yeah. Mark, I just want to ask you another question about churches and Christian organisations, which are doing a lot of good work. But the stats show that 2 in 5, that is 44% of Australians, however, do not value anything about the local church. Mark, is it that they don't know what their local church is doing, or is it that they're just totally turned off because of the previous issues, like you mentioned, the Royal Commission, maybe homosexual, same-sex marriage, all these things that communities now negotiating?
Well, definitely the perceptions Australians have of Christianity as a whole, or the church as a whole, does have some brand damage on those local churches, and they think, those religious institutions, that local church, they're probably a bit exclusive and a bit hypocritical, and so there is a little bit of that. But I think largely it's that they just don't know a lot about that church, and that the only figure higher than the negativity they might have towards the local church is the proportion of people who didn't know much about what was going on in that church. We did find that people are quite warm towards the local churches in their area. I mean, they're a bit unsure about what they were on about, but they saw a lot of the good that they did in that area. And I think it's a great opportunity for churches to perhaps connect more with their communities and understand that those around them do have a good perception of what they're doing in the community and in the area, but they're just not aware of some of the details of that. So, there's a bit to be done in terms of bridging that gap between the local church and the local community.
Furthermore, 1 in 2 Australians, 53%, consider Jesus' life to be extremely or very important in the aspects of history and culture of the world. Yet 2016 figures indicate that people identifying with no religion had grown to 30.1%. Carl, why do you think there's this massive cause for disconnect?
Yeah, it's intriguing, because we've just done a series called Jesus the Game Changer, how the life and teaching of Jesus changed the world and why it matters. And I think in some ways there's just a kind of lack of education. And I reticent to say that because everything seems to come down if we just educated people more, the world would be a better place, and that's proven not to be the case. But the idea that Jesus actually changed the world in quite remarkable ways. I mean, I was actually encouraged by the faith and belief outcomes that people actually saw Jesus as having some influence and being important. But often they don't understand how important Jesus is. And so if we could actually help people understand that our foundational values that we live on, like equality, like in the sense that everybody is of equal worth and dignity, where did that idea come from? We tend to think we were born with it, and everybody thinks that way, and everybody has always thought that way. That's just simply not true. And that idea that every individual has dignity and worth is a Christian idea that came from the Jewish culture into Christian faith, and that's not something that the Greeks invented. It's not something that came with the French and Italian Enlightenment. It came through the person of Jesus. And if you look at a whole bunch of things like that we should care, the value of women, that education should be a part of our society, literacy, all of that could actually be sheeted back to the person, the life and teaching of Jesus in the early church. And one of the things that we need to do as a church is to remind people and help people know that that's the case, which will actually grow their interest in faith and belief.
And I think that's really important. In politics, I'm constantly, fighting for special religious education to stay in our schools. And a lot of people say, why? We don't need it in there. And I constantly talk about, we're worried about the kids' physical health. So we have PE teachers, and we're trying to get rid of sugar, and we have a sugar tax. We're worried about the kids' mental health, which is very important too. We have psychologists, we have welfare counsellors in our schools, we have school nurses, and that's fantastic for the mental health. But we also need people with spiritual health as well to be looking after our kids' spiritual health. And I think that's a very important factor. For me, social justice, in terms of you mentioned, is at the heart of all that Christian Democratic Party policy. We believe in the teachings of Christ, obviously. We work hard to put these forward in amending bills or legislation. Mark, is all this hard work enough to draw people back to the church or having confidence in the church?
I think it's certainly heading in the right direction, and some of these statistics from this national study are very positive indeed, that the majority of Australians see that Jesus' life was extremely or very important for the history and culture of the world, that Jesus was a transformative person who is a great example, that the characteristics of him were almost wholly regarded as very positive, and that those who follow him, as Carl said, the top 5 characteristics of Christians that they know are very positive as well. So I think that Australians recognise the great things about Jesus and about those who follow him. And therefore, the more we can live that and communicate that and create opportunities for churches to connect, I think the better that is. I think, in other words, all of this hard work of highlighting the values of Jesus and the social justice that he lived out and trying to walk in his footsteps as fellow Australians, I think is so key. And if anything, is going to turn around some of that negative stereotyping that the population has, because they've seen on the news some of the worst of what people have done in Jesus' name. So I think your average Christian is going to be the great antidote to that negative message that they've seen.
And that brings me back to the former thought of, the reason of having special religious education and why I'm passionate about Scripture in schools. You've got a mentor like Christ. Now you think of, we have sadly nearly 1 woman killed every week in Australia because of domestic violence. Yet you've got Jesus who says, love your wife like I love the church, so much so that I gave my life for her, the church. If every husband would just love his wife like Christ loved the church, we'd abolish domestic violence. So why wouldn't we want this Christ and this mentor in our school system?
Absolutely. I mean, interesting, Rodney Stark, who we interviewed for the series, talked about the fact that the lot of women within the early church, the first followers of Jesus, their lot was so much better than every other woman in the Greco-Roman world that it's a wonder that all women didn't become Christians immediately. Because his point is like, we read that about Jesus, and it's like, of course Jesus said that, or of course Paul wrote that about giving yourself. No man in the Greco-Roman world acted like that. You know, they didn't think like that. So it's actually helping kids in schools right through the ages understand that the values that we hold to, where they came from, what are the foundational values that we hold to, and the idea that they came from some humanist ideal 100 years ago is just not true, and that's the thing we need to communicate.
Yeah, well said. When public opinion changes, government policies seem to follow that trend. We call it in politics retail politics, and now you see it. You've just seen an exchange of prime ministers in Australia, actually quite a lot of them, sadly. One of the reasons is they read the polls, the public's not happy, so we ditch the PM. Has been critiqued against the public polls. Sadly, a lot of policies are made by governments because of retail politics, not because it's good law. What does this mean for the church? And do you expect this will rise in the future in terms of government leaderships across New South Wales and Australia?
Yeah, look, democracy is a great thing. You know, like it's a great thing, and while there's lots of weaknesses, it's certainly better than any other option any of us know about. But it comes with its downside, and what you've just explained is the downside. The difference between retail politics, using your name and your thought, and Christian faith is we stand on a set of values that really shouldn't change, and that we're not looking to be popular. We're looking to say, here's what we hold to be true.
Yeah.
And this week it might be popular, next week it's unpopular. That's not going to change our view. I feel for people in the political realm dealing with polls all the time. It's difficult, but it does challenge people to, you know, there have been great politicians at great times who have stood for things that weren't popular, but they stood for them because they believed at that time they were right, without going into any details. In Australia, in the not that distant past, and those things demonstrate that if you're clear about what you hold to, you communicate it well, and you're not just about yourself, and you're not flip-flopping all the time, there's a good chance that Australians are going to go with you. But that's not to say that politics is not a really difficult process.
So Mark, you've said that leaders of industry drive the change and they shape the trends. Do you feel that government leaders can influence real change? And do you feel that they can influence change in how people feel about religion and spirituality through both policy and values?
Yeah, definitely. You know, Australians look for leadership. Australians are looking for, as Carl said, conviction leaders who can not only have a point on which they don't change, but live that out with authenticity. And so I think that if you've got political leaders that are clear on where they stand, they can communicate that effectively, they can engage with the community to show why they hold that perspective, and they're passionate about it. I think, you know, Australians respect that. And we are in a country that is ruled by the rule of law, and legislation has power, and policymakers, politicians are ultimately our elected representatives to make our society function well. And so it's a great role that they have, and you know, every adult votes every so often. You know, when the elections come around, it's part of our whole system. We will whinge and complain about it, but we all are secretly glad, you know, for the system that we've got, for this great land of peace, this democracy that functions well, and the stability that we have. And it's those politicians that have to put up with a lot of negatives, you know, but are offering leadership, and I think they are, in so many ways, shaping this nation and being examples.
And look, the key thought on this at the moment is what makes great democracies across the world over centuries is freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. And I think for our country and others around the world, that is actually up for grabs.
Yeah.
And I think that's the place of politicians, and in legislation and in attitudes, need to say, well, we're going to stand with a freedom of conscience, because once we lose that, the outcomes are not good.
And that's a good point. I mean, we've got a religious freedom bill before Parliament now. It's sad that we need an Anti-Discrimination Act. Actually, it'd be better to operate without one, but it has to come with tolerance. You know, of course, we have tolerance for people, but we have intolerance for issues, obviously. But when those things clash, obviously we need laws to outwork that. Unfortunately, if we would all work out of that other spirit, you know, a good spirit on things in terms of saying, we understand you've got a worldview, I've got my worldview, let me be loyal to my worldview, you've got a worldview, we're not hurting each other, let's you know, get along. It's sad that we have to have laws that that are crushing this out to such a degree. Is how far can we crush each other before, you know, we realise that this system is not working?
Yeah, and you know, we have tolerance and diversity for everybody, but Orthodox Christian faith, and there's not quite so much tolerance or diversity.
Well,
and I think that's
you might be able to comment on that. I think in terms of the persecutions across the globe, I think that the Christian church is the most persecuted body of faith across the globe. Would that be right?
Yes, in the last 100 years, more people have died than before that. There's now what we face. Look, a negative Facebook post is not persecution. You know, people being rude on the news at night is not persecution. It's tough and it's unhelpful. Whereas there are people who are dying for their faith. Yeah. That's persecution. But that doesn't mean that we just stand back and allow people just to say what they like and dismiss and discredit and to speak in ways that are untrue and unhelpful about Christian faith. Yeah. We need to stand against that. But I think we need to be careful to not pretend that that's persecution.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I was actually speaking in Parliament the other day, and I was saying this: how is it that if we went out in the street and I said those things to you face to face, you could take me for defamation? But the fact that it's on social media, you can just say as much as you want and get away with it. So we really need to clamp down on that stuff. It's not, as you say, helpful. Do you think amongst all the secular voices in Parliament that there is probably room for a Christian voice?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, even that census results show 52%, that's the majority of Australians, identify their religion as Christianity. We know that 3 in 4 Australians are either warm towards Christianity or neutral towards it, you know, if not identifying with it. 1 in 4 are opposed to Christianity, but it's important that that minority doesn't overwhelm the majority and shut down debate, discussion, or shut down the opportunity for Christians to be in the public square and to have influence. And I think to have Christians in Parliament representing what are the majority of Australians, even if not Christian, certainly people of faith, is so important.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to add to that, you know, because it's what Mark's saying is absolutely true. If it's a slim majority, but still a majority, from a representative democracy, those views ought to be in the public marketplace. And one of the most important is not just the press, but politics. So, you know, it's almost like saying to Christians in politics, you ought to be unapologetic about that worldview because you actually sit in the majority of people.
Absolutely. The frustration we get on the road is that people are saying Christianity and politics don't mix. What's your response to that, Carl?
Well, I mean, they always have, they always will. It's you know, I think when you go back to what you were saying about retail politics, it doesn't mix when, you know, you've got to toe the party line, you know, the idea that anything goes, you know, whatever it takes, Graham Richardson's book, you know, you change your mind all the time. Well, that doesn't go with a character of faith and belief which says this is where I stand, and whether you don't like it or not, this is where I stand. So I can see why people think it doesn't mix from that point of view. But outside of how it's played out, there's no reason it can't be a part of the public conversation.
And faith, you know, informs every part of our life, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, if someone's
right.
a person of faith, well, it informs their relationships, informs how they work, it informs how they communicate, how they serve and view their neighbours, how they have a heart for, you know, those that are the most struggling. And so, therefore, to have policy shaped around that faith, you know, this isn't religion, it's just the issues of life, and therefore, you know, a policy that's informed by some of those faith perspectives is a policy that's going to, you know, offer a better outcome to humanity.
It's a really good point. When I was nursing, you know, that they used to have, don't bring your home life to work. But how do you not bring a broken marriage to work? How do you not bring a sick child who's at home to work? You bring it to work, you know, and you've got to work through those things. When you're with your colleagues, you know, you can't separate them. You are a mum or you are a dad, and if you've got a sick child, that is part of your day. You can't separate them. And it's the same with faith. We can't separate our faith from our workplace or from our community. We've got to be true to it. And part of that is living that in our workspace or in our social areas. I just want to say that you're right about democracy. I always say, it's like the Knights of a Round Table, and if one seat's empty and that's the Christian seat, policy is made by those who turn up. And the last thing we want is all the secular people making all the policies for us Christians. We need to be at the table because we genuinely believe that the Bible has a better way of living life. And I mean, that's what we try to adhere to. And Lord help us if that opinion is not around that table. Can I just thank you, Mark and Carl, for being on the show? I just really appreciate your time. And we hope we can do this again, maybe sometime. It was fantastic. So thank you for your input.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
And for those watching this show, I encourage you to go to my website, paulgreen.com.au, and leave your feedback on whether you would support such a show continuing on Christian TV, and further, what topics you think we could cover in future episodes on Church and State with Paul Green. Until next time, God bless.